So what I'll do is I'll take you through this presentation on immersion and talk about some of the significance of immersion and what immersion means in terms of theme spaces. As a reference point here, if you didn't get a chance to look at it, there's a pretty good book that just came out called CLAD Book, and CLAD stands for the Community of Leisure Architects and Designers. And so the PowerPoint essentially takes you through this article, so you can certainly look at that later. I also have some videos on my YouTube channel that I'll mention as well. And so I start off here, and again I'll talk about my background in a second as a cultural anthropologist, trying to think about theme parks, theme spaces, museums in a serious sense. And so to give you a little sense of the background, I first started not too far from you guys in Houston, I guess, working as a training coordinator at Six Flags Astroworld, a theme park which has since closed. And I know the Super Bowl is coming up, but Astroworld for me was a starting off point thinking about theme parks. Since those days, since I was working, and I did my PhD at Rice in cultural anthropology, and so my dissertation was focused on looking at the dynamics of working in a theme park, all the different issues, and so forth. Since that time, I wrote a number of books, Theme Park, the Immersive World's Handbook, which I'll talk about today to some extent, and then recently this reader came out called A Reader in Themed and Immersive Spaces, and it's actually done through a open source project, so it's freely available on the internet for download, so you can certainly look at. I'll mention at the end of my PowerPoint two of the chapters in there that talk about immersion that could be interesting to the class. So I start off talking about here, looking at this image of Gardens by the Bay in Singapore, and if you haven't been there, it's certainly an amazing immersive space to check out. Immersion in so many different dimensions, visual, audio, and so forth. When we're talking about immersion and we look at the roots of it, we're thinking about things like plunging or dipping into water. And so it's the idea, of course, that we are fully affected by whatever happens in that immersive space. It could also be a book or a novel, a theater show, video game, virtual reality experience. And what we're talking about is the guest is engaged at these levels of depth and experience. And if you go to the greatest theme spaces today, places like Disney and the Wizarding World of Harry Potter at Universal theme parks, what I think makes the theming and immersion so effective is that you do feel as a guest that you're fully enveloped within that space. You can fully experience it. And as workers in theme parks, for those of you who have worked in theme parks, we often talked about in our training, how can we greater engage the guest in the space such that they enjoy it? So we're talking about using words from anthropology, ideas of holism, and saying to make an effective experience for a guest, if you have a themed or immersive space, you have to think about all the different dimensions in which you can engage that guest. And some of the words I would use would include awe, forgetting, connection, organic, feelings of lost time, intense emotions, and of course memory. And so all of those go into a lot of the spaces that we might consider. I have on the bottom here, if you're a fan of, I don't know how many of you like Black Mirror, the British show. I think it's an amazing show, and they had an episode, I think they're in the third season now, about survival horror. And it's I won't give away what happens, but the plot is it's a guy who agrees to be part of a new genre of survival horror video games, and the idea is that it's fully immersive. I mean, it really does get the user completely captured or a part of the space. Now, when we talk about immersion, I think we shouldn't just, of course, limit it to theme parks and themed museums. We could talk about great forms of storytelling. If you're reading a book and you're totally captivated by the narrative, you're captivated by the characters and the experiences, that is a form of immersion. We could also talk about, of course, the theme spaces that we'll discuss today. We could discuss branded experiences more and more. A lot of places that develop brands are trying to get us fully immersed in those spaces. An example of that would be the American Girl place, which is a very interesting store, multi-dimensional experience geared at younger girls and their parents. Of course, we could also talk about film. We could talk about video games, virtual reality. There's a certain degree of hybridity these days where we combine two of these forms together. So, for example, you might see more and more roller coasters that involve Oculus glasses or virtual reality experiences. And then we shouldn't forget about language and culture immersion programs. Years ago, I taught in our college's immersion, cultural immersion program in London, and it really does affect people when you take part in one of these experiences and you're part of a culture. You visit that culture, you experience it firsthand. What we call in anthropology the emic or insider's perspective. That gives you a sensibility of what it feels like to be immersed. When we talk about immersion, I would say there's three things going on here. Still thinking about this and developing this, but one is a foundation. And the foundation typically would be the story that's being told. Again, if you're reading a novel, it's what captivates you as a reader in that story, that narrative that is drawing you in. So the foundation is something that's integrated, it's expanded, it's expressed. There's a means, and so this could be vivid writing if you're reading a novel or a poem. If it's a theme park, it's going to be all the material technology, the architecture, the design standpoints that are experienced and felt by the guest. And then this last one, I think, is often left off when people talk about design. A lot of times you'll read say a Disney Imagineering text. They'll talk very heavy about the first two things. So if they're talking about Animal Kingdom in Florida, their amazing zoo theme park hybrid, they get into the technologies, the design, the forms of storytelling, but they don't maybe cover that third dimension, which is the guest's acceptance of what they're feeling, the psychology of it, the interpretations. I guess we're getting sounds like a little feedback. I don't know what that's coming from.
Yeah,
okay.
I'll try and move the speakers
further
from the microphone, perhaps.
Oh, that could be it, yeah. Little feedback loop.
Is that better? Can everyone see all right?
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So and so the last one, I think is really key when we talk about the guest's acceptance of what they're feeling, what they're reading, what they're experiencing, and that takes us, I would say, to Aristotle's notions of catharsis. And catharsis is often talking about the idea that you want to connect with the characters, you want to connect with what you're experiencing. As Gardner talks about in his book on literature, you're suspending your disbelief. So you're saying, I'm going to accept that as I'm walking into the wizarding world of Harry Potter, I'm going into a living landscape of J.K. Rowling's texts. And so that's really key. And so we can't forget that when we're discussing immersion, we often, I think, want to leave off that component. And because I come at this from a cultural anthropological standpoint and not a designer, I think I tend to focus on that one maybe a little bit more, because I'm thinking about, why is it that someone would want to go to the Venetian in Las Vegas and experience that space, or what would draw them to a particular theme park and why would they want to spend hours and hours there, coming back time and again. So probably looking at Aristotle's catharsis, it's because they feel something, they're moved by it, they're even changed by the whole experience. And there's a definition there of catharsis at the bottom of the screen. And so anytime we're talking about it, we're discussing strong emotions. And again, art forms out there, and I'll encourage everyone later when we talk about research, to, not just to study the theme spaces, the museal spaces, the museums, the theme parks, but to go after all forms of immersive drama, theater, performance art, literature, to really think about this in a multidisciplinary as multidisciplinary aspect as possible. So basically, to cover all the grounds and not just the focus on the themed and immersive spaces that are kind of the obvious spaces, since we're interested in these topics. We could talk about, in terms of immersive spaces, what are some of the limitations and challenges? One of the big ones, to go back to my biography about Astroworld, we were at the time the smallest, I would say the cheapest of the Six Flags parks. We didn't have maybe the best immersive rides. And so in a sense, sometimes we were challenged if we were working in a particular theme land or at a given ride or show. we were challenged sometimes by the lack of those second components I talked about: the foundation, the technology, the storytelling, and the material culture. So it's sometimes a challenge when we don't have the ability to do what you see pictured here in Pirates of the Caribbean. If you have Disney's backing, the Imagineering, the capital, the technology, all the incredible blue sky design crews and all that, you have an advantage in a sense. Now that's not to say just because you have that, it's going to be amazing. We can all think about a movie that maybe had a multi-million-dollar budget but was a total bomb. It was not convincing. It didn't give us that sense of catharsis because there was something missing from it. So I'm not saying that it's always the case that if you have more capital behind you like Disney Imagineering, you're going to produce a better themed or immersive space. But that is certainly a part of it, and something that I often reflect on when I think about my experiences at Six Flags Astroworld. Now we could move to talking about some immersive foundations, and these would, in a sense, perhaps determine or affect how you go about creating immersion. The first of these I call the form of a space, and it could also be called like the genre of a space. So obviously, if you operate a casino, if you have a themed resort, there are going to be certain things that you emphasize. If you have to emphasize your gaming and your shows, you then maybe have to change some of the design directions such that they are created in tandem with what you're trying to deliver to the guests in terms of your services, what you're selling, what you're offering to the guest. Now, the picture on the bottom there actually is a surprise and maybe a contradiction to this. This is the Cerritos Millennium Library in Southern California, and it's the very first library that was designed using principles of Pine and Gilmore's important book, The Experience Economy. So they wanted to create a library that really looked nothing like a traditional library. And very explicitly in their design directions or manifesto, if you will, they talk about the fact that they wanted to not compete with theme parks and other themed and immersive spaces, but to reference them to some degree. And I should say this is controversial because a lot of people would say, well, the form of a library should be all about engaging readers in periodicals, in books, in media, and not focusing on theming. And I only have one image there, but if you're interested, you can go to their webpage. I actually have a video I've done on my YouTube channel that takes you through all the themed and immersive spaces at the Cerritos Library. So, the form of a space doesn't always dictate what you're doing in terms of your immersion, but I think it often does. The brand of a space, the brand that is part of the design of a space, certainly also impacts what you're trying to deliver to the guest. This is a shot here below quite a few images of what I think is a pretty conceptual mall in Berlin, the Bikini Berlin. And it's a different type of mall that focuses on, a lot of people have called it a hipster mall. So there's, in a sense, like a hipster vibe that is present there. But they're trying to do something entirely different. And so for me, the coolness of their brand is they're trying to shift our perceptions of what a mall should look like. Because a lot of times malls are, anchor stores and a bunch of, typical, chain stores in the middle. We can also look at brands reinventing themselves, and this is the Polaroid Photo Bar in Las Vegas, which since I've been there last, I heard underwent some transformations. But one of the cool things about this is that, Polaroid, of course, as an instant camera technology, had to think about as a brand how to reinvent the technology of what they're engaging people with, the consumer with. At the same time, they try to do this through a space that, as you can see at the tables there, combine physical technology, so your typical Polaroid cameras, with new stuff, allowing people to download things to social media, allowing people essentially to re-engage with the brand in some new ways. And so for me, this is an exciting opportunity to think about a brand changing and then the immersiveness of the brand changing in tandem with it. Now, another foundation for immersive spaces would be the social components of a space. If you go to Fremont Street in Las Vegas and that exciting district near there, the East Arts District with the Container Mall and so forth, very often it's the social components of the space that are drawing people there, that are giving people a sense of feeling a part of it. And I think that's key with some spaces that maybe try to connote excitement and immersion at the level of mutual enjoyment with other guests. And so, depending on the type of space, again, the social side of it could allow the designer to better engage the guest in it. I'll talk about a few times in my talk today about the World Exposition in Milan from 2015, which I had a chance to visit. One of the challenges, of course, is that if you're dealing with millions of people coming into a space like here at the World Expo, you have to think about design maybe in some practical senses that don't always allow you to think about the immersive potentials. You have to think about how can you effectively cue people through the various spaces and still give them that sense of enjoyment, that sense of immersion in the space. Technology is a key one, and I'm sure if you're studying technology these days, you're thinking about immersion of the guest at some level, or immersion of the user if you're designing video games. I recently did a project with a student from, I forget the university, but in Dallas, and he was working on the hybridity of video games and theme parks. And more we're seeing this, where we're going to say, okay, you experience all the themed, tactile, visual things in that space, but we're going to throw technology on top of it. In this particular case, at World Expo, the Germany pavilion did what I thought was a really amazing job. I don't have video of this here, I do on my YouTube site, but basically they gave the visitors to the space what they call seed books. They were basically pieces of cardboard, and they had nodes on them, and as you moved through the various pavilion exhibits, you were basically interacting with the space. And for me, this was a great way to use technology to increase the immersion of the guest in the space, to also communicate some information, because one of the things that happens at a World Expo is you're trying to teach the guest something. You're trying to immerse them for the principle or the purpose of pedagogy, of teaching them an important lesson. In this case, Germany was trying to teach the visitor about ecology, about green technology, about new farming practices that could be beneficial to the planet. And so technology, of course, is an important component of theming and immersion. I make a note here on the side that we should think about not technology for technology's sake, but technology that aids us, designers, storytellers, in telling a story and delivering something for the guests. And I think it's a real problem. Some of the pavilions at the World Expo just basically said, okay, put on a pair of Oculus glasses and look at a three-dimensional space, which was cool, but it didn't engage the guests. And that's one of my things about immersion is I think sometimes we have the trappings, in this case, the technological trappings of immersion, but we don't have authentic immersion going on. So those are some of the foundations to think about. Next, we can go into talking very specifically about the guest and immersion. And this then takes us back to my initial point saying that we should, when we're talking about theming and immersion, not just think about the technology, not just think about the architecture, the design, the theming. Let's talk about what the guest brings to a space or to some form of immersion when they experience it in the world. The first of these is to say, we should consider differences. No matter maybe how similar we think a guest is to the next guest, every guest brings something different to that space with them when they visit it. Right now I'm doing some videos of some religious themed spaces I visited in Kentucky and Indiana in August, and one of the things I'm talking about in these videos is it's a challenge when you deal with political issues, religious issues, spiritual issues, because you don't know where everyone stands on some of these issues. For example, you go to the Smithsonian and you experience a museum exhibit on war. Well, how do you deal with the fact that you could have a veteran visiting that space and a peace activist visiting that same space? And that's, I think, a challenge for any designer, probably at that first level of immersion I addressed, which is the foundation, the story that you're telling prior to actually getting into the design decisions. Now, I have a image here of the great late Umberto Eco's open work. And the open work was a text that talked essentially about writing, talked about novels, talked about poetry. He referred to an open work as a story that left decisions or interpretations open to the reader of the text. And so he differentiates between an open work and a closed work. You have other individuals like the great French thinker Roland Barthes, who also talked about this and distinguished between a readerly text and a writerly text. A writerly text would be like the closed work, basically one where the writer didn't leave any decisions to you, the reader, when you read the text. Whereas the readerly text, or in Eco's case, the open work, left decisions to the reader when they engaged with the story. And I mention this because I think it's important if you're designing a space, an immersive space in 3 dimensions, to think about maybe not dumbing down that space so much that the guest is taken aback by it and basically says, well, this isn't really immersive because they're not allowing me opportunities to engage the space, to interpret it, maybe even, as I'll talk about later perhaps, leave my own mark on that space when I visit it. Now, at the same time, you can't have a space so open that it's possible, to have all viewpoints or all sides left to the guest. Years ago, a lot of designers were experimenting with rides where you could sort of press a button on your ride delivery vehicle and you would choose the ending. This happened with the Indiana Jones ride. And even there, it's not possible necessarily to think of a totally open, fully immersive sandbox experience. Even when you play a great video game that is an open world video game, it's not ever truly open, right? I mean, there's always a limit to that level of possibility for the guest. But it's something I want to mention today to your class because I think it's very important sometimes when we visit a space, particularly a museum space, we sometimes discover that it's dumbed down a little bit. And that's why my next statement is here. We shouldn't ever underestimate the guest's knowledge or experience. We shouldn't assume that they don't know something. For example, if they visit a museum, we shouldn't maybe lead them along in such a way that they feel offended by the fact that they are teaching us so much at the beginning, such that we feel like stupid, visiting that space. If you get a chance and you're in Southern California, check out the Museum of Jurassic Technology. It's the closest thing to a conceptual museum that I think you can experience. And that's an example of a museum that's challenging our perceptions of what a museum even is. Another space like this would be in London, Dennis Seaver's house, which is also very similar to this, very conceptual. Now, along these lines, to go back to the World Expo, there were pavilions, like in this case the Pavilion of Korea, that really did make an emphasis on the guest to try to get them to realize that they had a role to play in this case in terms of dealing with poverty and world hunger. And what I liked about many of the pavilions at the Expo was that they didn't take the guests for granted. They didn't assume that everybody necessarily was super green or ecologically conscious, but they balanced this. They balanced the didactic information that they gave to the guest. They didn't so hit them over the head with the information that the guests felt taken advantage of. So I think it's often like a sweet spot when you write the experiences, the narratives of the space, and when you do that design work. So try not to take the guest for granted. We should also realize that in terms of the guest's experience, immersion isn't always positive. If we look at, say, and those of you that know Berlin, many of the spaces in Berlin, as Berlin struggles to deal with, its past, many of these spaces are not trying to get the immersive experiences to be positive for the guest. If we're dealing with dark theming, often we're trying to affect the guest at existential levels such that they are disturbed, they are challenged. They are forced, in a sense, leaving that space to think about new issues, to consider things that they hadn't considered in the past. If you're curious about this topic, you could read my article on this in Attractions Management on controversial topics in themed and immersive spaces. And I mentioned there, the picture on the bottom is from Coney Island, that, going back to the very early 1900s, at the major amusement parks of Coney Island in New York, we saw many of these dark and controversial theme spaces and attractions being developed. So there is a historical legacy there, I would say, in terms of some of this. I would also go back to another pavilion, in this case Brazil, from World Expo 2015, and talk about challenging immersion or theming such that we keep in mind we don't always have to have forms of theming or immersion that are realistic. So in other words, when we're looking at this image of the Brazil pavilion, we're not at all experiencing, say, a typical ecosystem from Brazil. In fact, we're experiencing something quite conceptual. The idea behind this is that each and every guest, if they wanted to, would walk a pathway from the very back area there into the perspective here of the person in the yellow shirt. So in other words, you would walk along this pathway, and depending on which pathway you chose, in some cases you would almost fall over. You might have to, hold on to another guest in that space. And I call this a conceptual space because, for me, the net structure that you walk on, the challenge of navigating that structure, falling down, but then maybe someone next to you catches you, is a metaphor of kind of the future of our society and of the world. And if we look at the world, today, from Europe to the U.S., there's a lot of strife, there's a lot of discord. And so for me, this was one of the most clever and interesting forms of immersion because they didn't take us through a rainforest or something that was very typical to what we might expect in terms of a very realistic form of immersion or theming. So I would say immersion can be conceptual, and we shouldn't forget about those possibilities. We can also talk about immersion being supplemented by the new technologies that are out there. If you pass through Singapore, you have to check out the airport. Absolutely amazing. And one of the things they have there, in addition to this, there are many other attractions to check out, but they have this pretty interesting social media tree that allows you to interact with your Facebook account and to take photos and videos and so forth. That's an example of using a technology in a space in a way that I think immerses the guest and also connects him or her to their own world, in this case, the world of social media. At the Japan Pavilion, back at World Expo 2015, they did this through very innovative apps. And in fact, they had a opportunity where guests could basically take their phone or smart device, put it inside a box, basically, that would program it for an interactive experience with the exhibit. And more, what's going on in the world of design is that designers are realizing that we can supplement the guest experience with apps, with technology. I'll talk about in a second what I call the life space, but basically the idea here is you're extending or supplementing the immersive experiences of the guest in the space. My warning on this is to say, like I did earlier, don't use technology just for technology's sake. It's really easy to throw an app in and say, okay, interact with the space, but then that might not authentically be seen by the guest as a form of interaction that is meaningful in terms of the storytelling in that space. So what I'm suggesting here is that in the old days we had the idea that excuse me, the guests would go to a theme park, and when they left the theme park, the physical space, they went back to their own home, the next location where they were traveling, and that was it. In today's day and age, the immersion, I think, could happen in a much different sense. So before you go to the theme park, you interact maybe with the storytelling via the website. If you get a chance to check out the Wizarding World of Harry Potter, they have a pretty impressive website that does some of this. So in other words, I can prep myself before I visit the space with some of those foundations, when I then get to this space, my sense of immersion is maybe heightened or expanded upon. And then when I leave the space, the same thing. I can still connect with it. And so by using interactive technologies, by using mobile media, augmented reality, in a sense, we can increase potentially the guest's interaction with the space. We're connecting things like time, space, meaning, and experience in some new ways that we haven't tried before. The reference point here would be previous forms of storytelling, like the slide here I'm using to illustrate transmedia storytelling. So the Matrix is kind of dated, as a media form, but what's interesting about the Matrix is if you want to fully experience everything about the Matrix, you really have to engage everything. You have to engage the three movies, play the video games, engage with the animated features, go to the web, look at the comics, whatever, and have this entirely transmedia experience. Transmedia storytelling is basically saying you don't have to experience a story, its characters, the narratives, the plot, only through one form. In the past, that one form maybe was the film. Today, it's much more expansive. And my excitement would be that that more theme parks and museums take advantage of this, because I think it's really the way of the future in terms of what is happening or maybe will happen with theme parks and theme spaces. So the last section here is on some keys to immersion, talking about how maybe we can better understand what's happening in, say, an effective immersive space versus one that is not as effective. Again, to go back to my background as a cultural anthropologist, we often talk about the emic or insider's perspective. That's the view of the culture by the person or from the person who knows that culture. And so if you're going to a space and you want to study that space, don't just study the design of it. Don't just study the architecture. Don't just study what's happening in that space. Talk to some people and say, why were you engaged? Or what was it about this space that engaged you? Or conversely, why weren't you engaged with that space? And as I say there at the end, this is a really complicated issue. And this is where I think anthropologists and sociologists and psychologists bring something to bear. We're talking about behavior. We're talking about interactivity and how, in this case at the Slovakia Pavilion, these guests interact with that space. What affects their level of interaction? How can we make it better? How can we understand what the guest actually took from that space when they visited it? Theming is an obvious one here. If you've had the chance to go to the reinvigorated Cars Land at Disney's California Adventure, there's pretty amazing theming going on there, some amazing theming. And I think for me, theming is such an effective approach because you have the possibility of affecting the guest at all levels of their consciousness. How they see, the sight lines in the space that they experience, stuff going on with the crowds as they experience the space, the sounds, the sights, the smells, the tastes, everything about it. The Wizarding World of Harry Potter, again, for me, is a pretty amazing theme space because they've covered all the details. I don't have any videos of these right here, but as you experience these spaces, they even have things set up with these innovative wands that parents often buy for their kids, and they get to interact with the various storefronts, with the various characters and the happenings that are going on in the various theme spaces of the Wizarding World. So theming for me has that possibility to create and maintain an entire world. And what's fascinating about the Wizarding World is if you know the books, and there's a parallel here to the religious theme spaces I mentioned earlier. If you know the Bible and you go to the Ark Encounter in Kentucky, you're going to appreciate it more, or better, if you will, because you have a foundation that you can bring with you. Likewise, and I'm not a Harry Potter expert, but for the people who are Harry Potter experts, they really do experience this, say, compared to me, at a much more nuanced or subtle level. And that's what's exciting for the design folks, is they can take advantage of the foundations that are there prior to the guest's visit to that space. Of course, in terms of design, we should always think about design itself is part of that immersion. I have another slide. This slide here is the Slow Food Pavilion from the World Expo. What I liked about this approach was that they took a very minimalist and subtle approach to immersive design. And one of their keys was that they wanted every one of these spaces to be repurposable. They wanted to be able to take this space after the expo closed. The World Expo only lasts for, say, 6 months. And after that time, kind of like with the Olympics, the question is, what do you do with the space? What do you do with the raw materials? So it was very important for their design standpoint to be able to take all the buildings and to, I believe it was Tanzania, to take it to another nation and to repurpose it for a new cause. So in this case, they had a conceptual notion behind their design, but I think they also did something that challenged some of the very realistic theme spaces that were present at the expo. The senses are very key. The senses, I think, offer the guests an opportunity to maybe better engage with the space. That's a still from Chapter 6 of the Immersive Worlds Handbook, which is focused on brands and the senses. And what I'm suggesting in this chart here is, as you engage with any space as a guest, you engage with it on multiple levels, sight, sound, smell, taste. It just kind of depends on the space itself. And so the value of the senses, it allows people to really touch and feel something. It allows the guest to potentially more fully experience that space. Now, the caveat with all of this is always that just because you have sensory things going on in a space, if you don't have a story behind that as a foundation, that may not come across to the guest as very authentic. As we think about other keys to immersion, we could think about if you're in a big space like a theme park, how do you connect one of those spaces to the next? And so if you go to Disney's Animal Kingdom, or I would say any Disney theme park, you discover that even the spaces that are in between a given theme land are effectively themed. They might have a design, like in this case of a light post, that is really innovative or really fits in with the rest of the theming. So what they do at Disney, as probably many of you know, is they don't take any of the spaces for granted, even if it's a transition space, even, for example, a restroom. And if you're interested in restrooms and toilet theming, as I call it, I have a video on this very topic on my YouTube site. So, it depends on the space, but we often talk about theming as trying to approach the whole, what we call holism in the social sciences. This is a still from the Immersive Worlds Handbook, and I suggest that, can you imagine the idea of total immersion in which you really feel 100% wrapped up in that space, such that you fully accept it, you fully feel like you are a part of that space. This is debatable, and in a few slides I'll talk about the philosophical existential side of things. It could be an impossibility to fully immerse someone in a space, and we could even question, is that a desirable thing? But it's something I think that designers and storytellers are thinking about. And storytelling, of course, is important because if you tell an effective story, if it's thought out, and if you don't take the guests for granted, the guest ultimately will maybe care about what's happening in that space a little bit more than a space that doesn't have effective storytelling. So the Germany Pavilion at World Expo, I thought, had very interesting characters that help tell the story of food and ecology. At the same time, if we recall the famous Disneyland or Disney quote, Disneyland will never be completed. It will continue to grow as long as there is imagination left in the world. It's important to remember that you have to change with the times. Tomorrowland, throughout the various Disney theme parks across the world, has been changing over time, trying to keep up with the outside world and how it changes. So a willingness to change your theming, your immersion, I think is also a key there. I kind of end on some of the points about the guest here again. We should think about the guest's purpose. Again, if we're visiting a theme space, we might want to think about, how does that guest experience that space? What does the guest really desire when they visit the space that I'm designing? And so what I try to do in my YouTube channel, and if you want this, you can look at the tiny URL here. But basically, I'm trying to do on this YouTube channel is to give you a sense of, give the audience a sense of what theme spaces are like from the guest perspective very often. To that end, I would recommend, to your class, when you're thinking about immersive design, when you're thinking about theming, conduct research. Go to theme spaces, read all the design books, talk to people, try to get a sense of what it is that makes immersion possible for the guests, what makes it powerful. And don't just, as I said earlier, limit yourselves to themed and immersive spaces. Maybe you love art films, and so you watch, a film of Tarkovsky's or something like this, and that really gives you an insight about a science fiction landscape or something like this. And as more and more immersion is becoming transmedia in nature, as we think about now Disney theme parks pulling into the whole Star Wars mythos into its theming, there's probably more opportunities to think about the synergy of, say, film and theme parks and other spaces. I don't mention this today, but if you want to check it out on your own, you can download for free the Reader in Themed and Immersive Spaces. 2 articles I would highlight there. One is Theming and Immersion in the Space of the Future. That talks about basically what we might expect theming and immersion to look like 10, 20 years from now. And then the other one is getting into the philosophical side of immersion, looking at, the existential questions of what does it mean to be immersed in a space, and are there situations where the immersion of a guest could maybe go too far. And I'll close on some of the ideas of, in this case, branding expert Kevin Roberts and his notion from Love Marks, which gets into the idea that when you're thinking about immersion, I think really it is about, to many degrees, about love or caring, about really doing something for the guest or the reader, if you're a novelist or a poet, such that he or she can better appreciate something that you're trying to tell to them. I would say we, as designers of these kinds of spaces or immersive experiences, we should think about dialogue. And I really enjoy seeing the United Arab Emirates Pavilion had an opportunity for guests to give feedback on what they were experiencing in that space. And so I think dialogue is a really important aspect of theming and immersion. And again, I close on this idea saying that immersion is never easy, but it's an art. It's something that you have to think about very critically. And let me switch off the go back to me, I guess, here. But yeah, it's an art. It's something that we should think about very critically, and I think we should bring our passions to whatever we're doing in terms of theming and immersion, whether we're designing theme parks, museum experiences, whether we're writing stories, designing virtual landscapes for gamers or whatever. So yeah, so I'll leave it at that, and I think we talk about some maybe questions that you might have about these issues.
All right, I've got a question. Right.
Yeah.
Just curious, what have you found to be the most profound or moving immersive experience that you've experienced yourself?
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly quite a few that would stand out, but I think one that I found quite amazing because of the element of surprise for me was Gardens by the Bay in Singapore. I had a chance to visit Singapore for a heritage conference, and I was told you have to check out Gardens by the Bay. And it's hard to describe, but again, you could go to my YouTube page and check it out. But what was really cool about Gardens by the Bay was that they effectively combined natural landscapes, so real trees, real plants, with hybrid technological trees and audiovisual experiences and really cool interactive opportunities. So for me, that was really, really an amazing space. And then I would also go back to some of my experiences in Berlin with some of the museums and memorials, because I think, when you're trying to deal with disturbing periods of human history, you have to engage the guest often in some different ways. And so for me, so many of the memorials and museums in Berlin that focused on the Holocaust were so existentially moving. And then the last one would be totally different space. I would say the Wizarding World of Harry Potter, because for me that was such a great opportunity to think about, you know, a series of novels and films brought into a three-dimensional realm for the guest. So those are some of my highlights, I guess.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ooh, I've got one question for
Sure.
you. How do you typically go rating the satisfaction level of the guests or users that you develop these experiences for?
Yeah, you know, so for me, a lot of my experiences, you know, go back to my theme park days at Astroworld, and what we typically did there was we often did exit interviews with guests. Our marketing department would ask people, you know, what they took from the space, how they understood it, what they liked and didn't like about it. But what's happening today when I work with some of the designers I work with, Gordon Grice, who's an architect who works with Forek Inc., what he's engaged in is much more expansive. And so they do, you know, these charades or opportunities to sit people down, to engage them in some of the design ideas, to interview them, to try to understand what they would benefit from or how they might understand a space. Again, this is going to vary with the type of space you're talking about. If it's an entertainment space, that's one side of you know, a series of questions you might ask a guest, versus if I'm developing a museum dealing with dark periods of human history, I'm probably going to have to think about engaging the guest in a discussion about that space in a different way. I think a real opportunity today is happening with social media. We should really think about leveraging guests, maybe through augmented reality or social media, in such a sense that they can give us feedback on site, and maybe the design decisions, if the technology is present, could keep up with that. The experience could change over time. And I know some of the patents that are coming out right now are talking about using, I think I just saw Universal is patenting a new drone technology, and somehow the drone is going to fly with the guests or groups of guests throughout their theme park experience, and then that's going to, you know, create a new form of interaction. Now, that could get kind of crazy, but it suggests that, you know, the future in terms of real-time feedback based on guests' experiences with the space is possible. So those are some ideas that come to mind.
I think you were kind of mentioning maybe aspects of kind of big data collection, where like this kind of like user responses.
Yeah.
And beyond just asking like direct questions, it seems like you're kind of suggesting that using this drone technology, you can almost like track where users or guests were located throughout the park, and using that information to figure out areas of prominence and such throughout your theme park. So I don't know if you engage in any of these kind of activities, but do you see as that like kind of a trend that these theme parks are moving towards?
I do, certainly, and I just recalled his name, Jeffrey Sanita. He was the PhD student who was doing this project up in Dallas, and part of his questioning was about big data. And I mean, I know a little bit about big data, but it's not an area of expertise. But what he was suggesting was that you could use some of this, as you're saying, to, you know, change the experiences for the guest. Maybe it's not a real-time change that's happening, but maybe you could alter the experience in some way over time, such that they are better engaged in the space. At the World Expo, they were doing some of this, but I think very often it was for the purposes of crowd control. The Magic Band technology that we were familiar with Disney, which is, I think, pretty innovative. You know, a lot of times that really isn't about extending the storytelling or immersion, but very practically allowing the guests to efficiently visit the space in the course of a day. There was a story in the LA Times years ago about a computer science guy who used artificial intelligence to figure out how to visit every single Disneyland attraction on a busy weekend day. And so, you know, I think some of that stuff, the danger is it's not going to be about the immersiveness and the storytelling. It's going to be about the practical stuff, the queuing, the trying to maximize the number of rides or attractions that a guest experiences in a given day. That was something we often heard from the negative side of guest interaction was, I paid $60 to visit a theme park and the lines were really long and, I didn't get to fully experience the theme park. So some of that could be the practical side of things versus, I think, the immersive side of things potentially.
I'm glad they're using these practical improvements. I feel like just improving the practical side eventually leads to improving the foundation eventually leads to improving the overall story. But
For sure.
I think that's really cool. Thanks for your insight.
Yeah, of course.
And just an interesting note, Stephen. So I read the other day that Universal, they're just about to open up. They're calling it their third theme park. It's really, I guess, a water park. But the plan is to have no lines whatsoever. So that's a big step. I'm not entirely sure how.
I have no idea how that's.
Wow.
It's supposed to be the big next step in theater space. So it should be interesting to see.
No lines. Okay, I gotta wait for that one.
That's their Volcano Bay water park in Orlando.
I don't know how that sounds super cool though.
Yeah.
Cool. Lazy river down
Just
concepts like that.
That too.
Got any other big questions?
Anyone else?
I've got one last kind of other question, if you don't mind. I was wondering if you worked with any virtual reality experiences or experiences tailored more towards a direct emotional goal. Okay, to phrase this, I'd have to give you an example. For some VR experiences I've heard being developed recently, they tackle more psychological problems or just psychological challenges that people have.
Oh.
For example, there would be a lady that's afraid of heights, and they wanted to help her kind of approach this challenge that she's had. So they developed a VR experience it would be perfectly safe for her, but she'd be able to walk across a pole suspended on a virtual, between two virtual buildings. And the experience is supposed to be wild because she could see and in 3D and just the wind rushing through her headphones and such. I was wondering if you worked with any experiences like that that are tailored more to a direct psychological.
Yeah, I haven't directly, but it reminds me of I end at the Immersive Worlds Handbook, the last page or so. I talk about very similar to this idea of love. I have an image here of Celebration Health in Florida. I don't know if you probably can't see it, but it's an MRI machine, and it is designed with sandcastle theming. And what I would suggest is that in arenas where we're dealing with assisted living and memory care for patients with dementia or Alzheimer's, when we're dealing with medical experiences that are often very challenging or difficult, we can, I think, leverage technology, we can leverage immersion, we can leverage theming in some ways to, as you're saying, engage the guests at that psychological or existential level. So where I see some of this going would be to design spaces maybe that comfort the guest more. I saw recently technology that basically created for people that lived in really small apartments, say in New York City. You could use, cruise ships are doing this today, I think either Celebrity or Royal Caribbean, are doing virtual walls or windows. So I could be living in my little teeny cubicle in my expensive Manhattan apartment of 200 square feet or something like this, and I could have this very expansive immersive experience just using VR, augmented reality, whatever is going on there. So I think this is important. I think we should not just gear these designs, whether it's the immersive technology or the theming and architectural stuff, just at entertainment. I think we should focus on the psychological issues. We should focus on the difficult issues. We could use some of these creative experiences to help people out. I mean, the world needs this kind of caring, I think, at this point in time. So for me, that's a great opportunity to challenge ourselves and to say, let's think about the psychological issues behind immersion. Let's focus on some of these existential issues. So I think that's awesome if more of this is happening, for sure.
That's a serious thing. That's pretty cool.
I've got one more question as well. So you mentioned just a moment ago these virtual windows and virtual walls for smaller spaces, and we are starting to see immersion a lot in more restaurants, hotels, consumer spaces. But how about other uses in the home? Do you see this becoming a larger thing in just people's homes, everyday people? I know we've got a lot of consumer VR technologies that are starting to show up in a lot of houses. But do you see other forms of immersion perhaps making their way out into the world?
Yeah, I think potentially. And one of the things when I was working on the latest book, the Themed Immersive Space Reader, I was really trying to look at this exact issue of theming in the home. And certainly there are examples of people who maybe love a particular movie, and so they're a Trekkie, and so everything in their house is Star Trek or Star Wars or whatever. But I was really trying to look at what are the potentials for people in terms of thinking about design, because if you go to whether it's IKEA or Crate and Barrel or these kinds of stores, so often I think there's a redundancy in terms of the design there. So from a physical standpoint, it would be exciting to think that there would be more opportunities for people to theme their personal spaces. But now, as you're getting at with technology, I think the only limitation there, right, would be price. I mean, it's certainly more and more possible that you can get very cheap monitors, cameras, 360 video. The technology is getting better, the price is coming down. So if the limitation for the consumer is price, I think over time we could see more and more of these virtual windows. The Peloton bike, if you've seen those ads for Peloton bikes, that's I think a great example of taking something physical and combining it with something technological. It's also social, right? Because you could, now I know the bikes are like really probably expensive and the subscription's probably expensive, but even gyms are thinking about doing some of this where if you're on a treadmill, you can have a video loop playing or something interactive there that maybe makes it more exciting for you or interesting, because we all know, walking on the treadmill at the gym is not as much fun as going to Big Bend or something like this, right? And experiencing a really remarkable, outdoor space. So for me, I would want to see it used in a way that augments something that we're doing in the home. I'm not totally convinced with, say, the Siri or the Echo, these new, devices that, you could ask, your virtual device how many eggs to put in your banana bread or something like this. I don't know if I'm so convinced with some of the stuff we're seeing now, but over time, maybe more of this will develop, and I think we could have some really innovative spaces that are just, the only limitations are what we maybe download into our screens or computers or devices. Great question, yeah, for sure.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah. I was thinking as well, this sort of theming in the home could also be really interesting to see in use in perhaps an assisted living or retirement home for comfort of patients and guests there to be able to kind of live in a more familiar setting, I guess. That could definitely be something interesting to see in the future.
Yeah, and my actually some experience with that. My father and mother recently in the last year were, I moved them into a assisted living, and the particular place they has like a virtual not virtual, but a physical main street inside the building. They have front porches inside the building. And it's what you're talking about. It's that sense of familiarity, because for folks with memory impairment, often you have to look at very, very basic forms of theming or immersion that comfort them, that give them a sense of familiarity at some symbolic level. So the palliative stuff going on in healthcare and in the world of assisted living, I think, is really key, as you mentioned, for sure.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Does anyone else have any last questions? All right. I think that's about all the time we have for today.
Great.
But thank you so much for
it was great.
allowing us to speak with you and giving us this presentation. Everyone, let's give a round of applause.
Okay. All right. Okay. Very good. And if you have any questions, you could contact me, virtually. So.
Absolutely.
Okay. Great. Okay. Have a great day. Enjoy your class. Bye.
Have a great day.